Okay, and with a smaller group, going to do a lot of reading. But the good thing is there are not any huge chunks. These are smaller sets of verses. So last week we learned about Ruth and Naomi, and they are back in Bethlehem, and Naomi's kind of a bitter person right now. So, but there is a whole story, and the author of this book, whoever wrote this book, he's writing it in a suspenseful style. He's leaving a lot of cliffhangers, and he's building more and more. So let's see where the story takes us. Verse 1.
Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side named Boaz. He was a prominent man of noble character from Elimelech's family.
Okay, could you say his name?
Elimelech?
No?
Boaz.
Boaz?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I couldn't remember if I heard it. So we got this new character, Boaz, and we find out right away he's a pretty good guy. He's worthy of character, and he's from the clan of Elimelech. Well, that means he's a relative. Now the word for relative here is not the word for kinsman redeemer. He's starting off, this is just a relative. He's going to build the story for this. We don't know what kind of relative. Some people say he was a nephew. Others say he was a cousin. We don't know. So it says he was a worthy man. He was rich. And what it means rich, he was rich. But he was also rich in character. He's virtuous and honorable and rich. He is the top of Bethlehem's most eligible bachelor list. Now, why he's not married? You would think someone like this would have been married already, but it's God's plan. He's not married, and he's not a young man. So, God has that in his plan. Verse 2 and 3.
Me?
Yeah.
Okay. And Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, "Let me go to fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone whose eyes I find favor." Naomi said to her, "Go ahead, my daughter." So she went out and began to glean in the fields behind the harvester. As it turned out, she found herself working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of
Eliminate. Yeah, that guy. Okay, so back in Leviticus 23, we learned that farmers were commanded to not completely harvest their fields, to leave the corners of their fields for the poor people and the widows, so that they could come in and glean and have food. It was their version of the welfare program. But it was a great version because it made them work for what they would have. They were not given it. The farmers were commanded to have a generous heart, and the poor worked for their food. So a good welfare program. Now Naomi doesn't tell Ruth, "Go glean in the fields." Ruth takes the initiative and says, "Is it okay if I go glean in the fields?" Now notice every time it says Ruth the Moabitess, it's to point out that she is not a local person. She is a foreigner. And we're going to see that. And there's sometimes where we don't see it. But it's purposeful to let us know that she's a foreigner and everyone else around her. So Ruth wants to get to work. She asked to go out to the fields to support her and Naomi. God is already at work. If Ruth had stayed home and waited for a spiritual feeling, she'd probably been waiting there a long time. But she had the initiative to go out. Can you think back on your lives when you can now see that God's invisible hand was working in your lives? There's so many times I can look back and say, oh, that was God. God taking care of things. So that's what God's doing here. He's taking care of things.
I like the phrase there in verse 2. As it turned out.
Uh-huh. What a coincidence. Yeah. Yeah, I saw a great definition of coincidence. It says, when God does a miracle and remains anonymous.
Mm-hmm.
So Naomi tells Ruth, yeah, go ahead. But she calls her my daughter. And in Hebrew, it's my daughter, not my daughter-in-law. She has fully embraced Ruth. By the way, did you know that Ruth is a noun? If you look in the dictionary, it means compassion for the misery of another. Never heard anyone use it, but that's what Ruth means. Okay, so these reapers that she's following, the harvesters, they're hired help. They're not slaves. These reapers would hire out to the local farmers to get their harvest done. Now, every village had a huge common field area. And with that field, each individual owner would mark off their portion. So when Ruth comes, there's no enclosed thing, only the landmarks of the owner, and it's not a big sign that says Boaz's field or anything. It's just what Boaz would recognize in others. No sign saying this is the way to Boaz's land. So is it a coincidence that Ruth went to Boaz's? It's God working again. Prime Minister Winston Churchill and President Franklin Roosevelt both almost died before World War II. Churchill was struck by a car in 1931 when he was crossing Fifth Avenue in New York City. And in Miami in 1933, someone tried to shoot Roosevelt, and he killed the man standing beside him. Both of them survived. And both of them were so instrumental in leading their countries during a time of war. Because God was in control. And he still is. So let's look at verses 4 through 7.
Now behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and said to the reapers, the Lord be with you. And they answered him, the Lord bless you. Then Boaz said to his servant, who was in charge of the reapers, whose young woman is this? So the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered and said, it is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. And she said, please let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves. So she came and has continued from morning until now, though she rested a little in the house.
Okay, Debbie made a comment that that makes so much sense knowing what the word ruthless means. So, I hadn't thought about that. That's a use of the word Ruth. Okay, so anytime you see the word behold, good morning, Betty. Think of it as God starting something. God is going to make something happen. So, behold is get our attention. So Boaz just happened to come to that particular field that day. And then he happened to notice Ruth, who happened to be in the shelter at the time of his visit. What if she'd been in the fields and not on her lunch break? But that God arranged it all. It's God's timing. Boaz here has a good relationship with his workers. They seem to love him. You can tell the real character of a person by how they treat their staff and by how they think of him. We had this one supervisor when I worked in San Bernardino County. They called her Attila the Hun because she just had horrible relationships with her staff and yelled at them all the time. Well, they didn't like her. So that's not Boaz. Boaz he greets these reapers with a godly greeting, and they greet him right back. And then Boaz notices Ruth, because it's a small town where everybody knows everybody else. And here's this strange woman. I lived in a county where the whole county was 2,000 people. And I went to my senior year of high school in there, and when I left and I'd come back and visit my parents, it would make the newspaper. Because that's how everybody knew everybody's business. So she's resting in a shelter, in a hut, in a tent. It's set up to give relief to the workers during the heat. So Boaz asks, whose servant is she? And the foreman responds, she doesn't belong to anybody. Women in those days belonged to someone. A husband, a father, a master, a brother, they belonged to somebody. But she had no one that she belonged to. Boaz is just asking about her relatives, who she related to. Notice the foreman points out twice that she's from Moab. But then he points out that she's associated with Naomi. Well, Boaz knows Naomi. Then the foreman tells about how submissive Ruth has been and respectful, how she asked permission to glean. She had a right to glean in the fields, but she asked permission. Boaz realizes that she's a relative through Naomi. But that's going to develop even more. Now, Ruth may not have known when she was out in the fields that she was being watched. The foreman looked at what kind of job she was doing, and he was impressed. And then Boaz was impressed. We're being watched too, even if we don't know it. And do people see a difference in us? It's important that we look different than the world. And Ruth looks different than the other people gleaning. Verse 8 and 9.
So Boaz said to Ruth, my daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with my servant girls. Watch the field where the men are harvesting, and follow along after the girls. Told the men not to touch you, and when you are thirsty, they go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled.
Okay, notice that Boaz speaks first. It would have been disrespectful for a woman to speak to a man first. So, what Boaz says to Ruth is pretty much, I have an offer that you can't refuse. It's not actually can't, but really shouldn't refuse. He calls her my daughter. It means he's going to treat her as he would his own daughter, because he is old enough to probably be her father. He tells her stay near his female servants, and the term is actually stay glued to them. Do not leave their side. So this is how it would all work. The men would lead their way with their sickles, cutting back and forth on the grain, and then the women would follow, and they would take the freshly cut stalks and bundle them into what are called sheaves. Then they would take the bundles to the threshing floor. So these women are the ones that are tying those stalks together. And it's when they're tying all those stalks together that a lot of grain would drop. And in Leviticus, it tells the farmers, don't pick up that dropped grain. Leave that for the women, the widows and the needy. So there's she's getting a lot of grain right there. Extra grain, because she's right there with them. She'd also have a chance to get to know the local women. But then he says, be careful, stay on his field. Don't go to anybody else's field because she will be protected. Remember, there's no fences, so it'd be easy to wander off the field. But if she stays glued to his female servants, she'll stay safe. Back in Deuteronomy 22, we heard how dangerous it could be for a woman out alone in the fields. It says, but if in the field the man finds the girl who is engaged, and the man forces her and lies with her, then only the man who lies with her shall die. But you shall do nothing to the girl. There is no sin in the girl worthy of death, for just as a man rises against his neighbor and murders him, so this is this case. When he has found her in the field, the engaged girl cried out, but there was no one to save her. So it was a dangerous thing to be in those fields with the men. But you notice Boaz tells his servant, the reapers, don't touch her. Boaz was protecting her honor, but God was protecting the messianic line, because from her the Messiah will be born. So had to have that line pure. There had to be no question of parentage in the line of Jesus. So again, was it an accident that she was in Boaz's field? That's God at work again. He tells her, if you're thirsty, get a drink. That's not one of the requirements of helping the needy. She's given the same access as the workers. Normally, she would have had to go to a well and draw water when she was thirsty. But the men have already drawn water, and she gets to drink from that. Boaz is so kind. At this point, there's no indication of a romantic relationship. We don't even know if Ruth was pretty. It doesn't say anywhere what she looked like. She was probably actually looking pretty ragged because she'd been in the fields all day. But that's not what Boaz sees. He sees a woman willing to work hard to support her mother-in-law, and he's attracted to that. Verse 10 through 13.
Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner? But Boaz answered her, all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward will be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Then she said, I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants.
So Ruth hears these incredibly gracious words that Boaz bestowed on her, a woman, a poor woman, a widow woman, a Moabite woman. She, on the surface, she was so undeserving. She was a stranger and alien. But that's a picture of grace. Boaz was extending grace to her. Same thing for us. We are so undeserving, yet God gives us his grace. Ruth has a wonderfully appreciative attitude, and her action of falling on her face is typical of an inferior who humbly submits to her superior. We never see Ruth question God about why she faced hard things. But she questions why God would bless her. What a different attitude. Boaz had heard about Ruth, heard about her devotion, Again, it's a small town where everybody knows everybody else's business. He encourages her. She is a new convert to the Hebrew faith, so he's helping her along. Older Christians, not in age but in faith. Well, my notes say should help younger Christians, but the Bible says we're required to help younger Christians. And so if we see a new Christian, we should come alongside them and help them in their faith. Verse 12, Boaz prayed for Ruth, but he doesn't know yet he's going to be the answer to that prayer. He just has to wait for God. And then she talks about being under his wings. That's a beautiful picture of God. What a better place to be, or what better place can you be than under God's wings. Ruth is like a tiny bird snuggling under the wings of a foster mother. So she says, let me find favor in your sight. That's a very polite way of saying thank you. She seems overwhelmed by Boaz's kindness. And she says, I'm not even worthy to be one of your servant girls. And yet you're blessing me. Verse 14 through 16 says, and at mealtime Boaz said to her, come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine. So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed to her roasted grain. And she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. When she rose to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, saying, let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. And also pull out some from the bundles for her, and leave it for her to glean, and do not rebuke her. So this might be the first hint of a romance. Boaz is showing extraordinary kindness and favor to let her eat with them. It would have been enough to invite her to eat, but he also invited her to fully share in the meal, even the dipping part. So they dip bread into vinegar that's made kind of like a weak wine. Great thirst quencher. Sometimes they would mix vinegar with a little bit of olive oil, and that helped your thirst so much. And talks about roasted grain. That was common for the period. You took wheat grain that wasn't quite ripe yet, because it's not the wheat harvest yet, but they take some of the wheat grain that's not quite ripe, and they roast it in a pan or an iron plate. And you ate that with or without bread. And it was a pretty tasty meal. So normally she would have been expected to bring her own lunch, but she gets invited to the meal. She's not one of the reapers, yet she gets to eat with the reapers, and she eats and she's satisfied. And when it says, Boaz said, come here, it means to come very near. She eats with the master. That's similar to Gentiles being invited to the table by Jesus. By faith, they can eat and be satisfied. So Boaz even serves Ruth. He does a lot of above and beyond. So she didn't eat everything that was offered. So she is planning to take it home to Naomi. She's going to take care of Naomi. But she had had enough. So after the meal, she gets back to work. She knows she still has a job to do. She doesn't sit there going, oh, the master likes me. I'm done. She works. What Boaz commands his servant, that's so much more than what is required in Leviticus. They were required to to leave anything they dropped behind, and the widows and the poor would follow well behind. Well, she gets to be up there, right up there with them, not behind. Even more, he tells his reapers to accidentally drop some extra grain so Ruth can pick it up. The Amplified Bible says he told them to drop handfuls of grain. So she'd have a lot. That means she gets a lot more grain than anybody else, and she gets the better grain. And one last instruction to his servants: don't rebuke her, don't insult her, don't shame her, disgrace her, don't humiliate her. Treat her nicely. Again, she's a Moabite. Moab was an enemy from the past. Right now they're in a peaceful period, but they had been enemies and fought over and over and over again. So she's from that country. So it'd be easy to see why people would insult her. But he tells them, don't you dare. Miss Betty, verse 17 and 18.
Is it where it starts with she said? Okay.
Oh,
The 3.
This is okay.
Or
verse 17 in chapter
2.
2.
Okay. She said, these 6 measures of barley he gave to me.
Oh, I think you're too far. 17?
She said these 6 measures. Is that starts?
No.
Are you into?
17.
What chapter?
2.
Oh, I'm not too
Oh,
far.
okay.
Sorry.
Those words were familiar, but not
So
yet.
she gleaned in the field.
Mhm.
Is that the right spot?
Yeah.
So she gleaned in the field until evening, and then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. She took it up and went into the city, and her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also took it out and gave Naomi what she had left after she was satisfied.
Yeah.
Her
Okay.
mother-in-law
That's
was that far now?
That's it. Yep. Okay, so God had blessed Ruth, but he blessed her hard work. She just didn't sit back and do nothing. She worked hard, and he blessed that. It was a sun-up to sundown day for the gleaning. Then she takes what she gleaned, and it's now past sundown, and she's beating out what she had gleaned. She probably would have used a curved stick or a wooden hammer to beat out that grain. Then she had to get it home. An ephah is probably about 5.5 gallons that she had to carry home. Couldn't be a weak person in that day. It's a great day's work for someone who had nothing. It's probably enough to last them a few weeks. So Ruth brings home that barley, and she brings home her doggy bag for lunch. Naomi knows, no, this is not normal. She probably expected a few handfuls. Naomi must be feeling pretty blessed at this time. Oh, and I didn't say there was a chunk. This is kind of a chunk. 19 through 23.
Then her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you gather barley today, and where did you work? May the Lord bless the man who noticed you." Ruth told her mother-in-law about the man she had worked with, and said, "The name of the man I worked with today was Boaz." Then Naomi said to the daughter-in-law, May he be blessed by the Lord, who has not forsaken his kindness to the living or the dead. Naomi continued, "The man is a close relative. He is one of our family redeemers." Ruth the Moabitess said, "He also told me, 'Stay with my young men until they have finished all of my harvest.'" So Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, Ruth, "My daughter, it is good for you to work with his female servants. so that nothing will happen to you in another field. Ruth stayed close to Boaz's female servants and gathered grain until the barley and the wheat harvest were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law.
This is the same woman who came into Bethlehem and said, "Call me bitter." She sees God's plan unfolding, and it's exciting when you see that happening. She's so excited that she asks 2 questions and makes a comment without waiting for an answer in between. She prays for blessings on whoever it was that blessed them. If you look back on every prayer in Ruth and every prayer we're going to meet, it's a prayer of blessing. And God answered every single one of them with blessings. She can see how all things are working together for good for those who love God. And of course, Naomi says, yeah, stay with Boaz. And by the way, he's not just a relative. He's a kinsman redeemer. So the story's building. First, Boaz is just a relative of Elimelech. Now he's a close relative. So she stays with Boaz, gleaning through the barley harvest and the wheat harvest. That would have been about 3 months. That's how long those 2 harvests last. Late March to middle of June. So let's look at chapter 3 and how the story is developing. Verse 1 and 2.
One day, Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, should I not try to find a home for you, where you will be well provided for? Is not Boaz with those whose servant girls you have been a kinsman of ours? Tonight he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor."
Okay, so harvest time is over. It's time to winnow the barley. So during these 7 weeks, Boaz and Ruth must have had a lot of opportunities to get to know each other. Now, it's not that they were dating in the same way our culture defines it. They might have spent time together in a group, the people working for Boaz. But they would have seen each other's genuine attributes. So Naomi says, should I seek rest or security for you? It's a rhetorical question. Yes, she should. She was concerned about Ruth's future. And to seek rest and security for a woman meant find a husband. But they're not going to go on a dating app and find one. But there is someone already there. Kinsman Redeemer. So Naomi is faced with 3 issues. She needs to continue the name of Elimelech now that her sons were dead. That was such an important thing in the Israelite culture. Then what should she do to protect Elimelech's inheritance? And then how could you provide rest and security for her faithful daughter-in-law? And it's all going to come down to one thing: Boaz. That would solve everything. So is Naomi planning a man trap? Go out and hunt down a reluctant Boaz for marriage? No, not at all. She is wanting to invoke the kinsman redeemer law from the Mosaic law. It is her right to do that. The kinsman redeemer was responsible for buying a fellow Israelite out of slavery, being the avenger of blood. Remember, they had those sanctuary cities, and if you killed someone, you ran to that city because you were running from the kinsman redeemer. Buying land back from someone that had bought your family member's land, and then carrying on the family name with a childless widow. So in this case, that's Ruth. Technically, it's Naomi too, but Naomi is too old to have children. So that's why they aren't doing the kinsman redeemer thing for Naomi. So since Boaz was a recognized Goel, that's a Hebrew word for kinsman redeemer, Ruth could appeal to him to marry her. If Boaz didn't fulfill this duty, the family of Elimelech was in danger of dying out. Again, that was a tragedy in Israel. Families were to carry on. Verse 3 through 5.
Therefore wash yourself and anoint yourself. Put on your best garment and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. Then it shall be, when he lies down, that you shall notice the place where he lies, and you shall go in, uncover his feet, and lie down. And he will tell you what you should do. And she said to her, all that you say to me, I will do.
So Naomi knows what attracts men. So she tells Ruth to pretty herself up and to put fragrant oils on, smell good, look good. They didn't typically take a lot of baths, so she would stand out if she smelled good. So she says, don't bother him till he's done eating. You know, those of you that have had husbands, you know, don't bother them while they're eating. So after Boaz is done and lies down, Naomi tells Ruth to find out where he is, uncover his feet, and lie down at his feet. Now, to a lot of people, it seems like she's offering herself to him sexually. She is not. We're going to see evidence of that. I mean, there's a few commentaries that, you know, just assume that, but there's too much evidence to say no. A servant laid down at their master's feet to be available to them to do whatever that master needed. It was an act of total submission. So, typically, when the men at this time would sleep, they would pile the grain up, and then they would sleep around the grain with their head facing the grain and their feet outward to protect the grain from thieves. So Boaz would have been one of those men with his head at the grain and its feet. He wouldn't have been in a tent or anything. He was out protecting his grain. And he wouldn't have been doing it by himself. So there's other people, other guys around. They must all sleep pretty well, pretty soundly, I guess. So again, if she's laying at his feet and there's all these guys around, it wouldn't make sense for it to attract him sexually. So Ruth came to claim a right. Boaz was her Goel, and she had the right to expect him to marry her and raise a family. But Naomi counseled Ruth, don't do this as a command, but as a humble servant. Trust in the goodness of Boaz. It's like saying, I respect you, I trust you, I put my life in your hands. Of course, there was a risk to it. Boaz could say, no way, I don't want you. But Naomi and Ruth had grown to know how caring Boaz was. How many husbands wish their wives submitted to them the way Ruth submitted to Boaz? But then do they provide the godly leadership and the care and the concern that Boaz has? How many wives wish they had a husband that cared and loved and treated them the way Boaz did? But are they in humble submission? Do they respect their husbands? So Ruth says, okay, I will do this. Verse 6 and 7.
So she went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law told her to do. When Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down.
Okay, so you see again, he's lying down at the grain, not in a tent. Not a great place to seduce a man. There's a few that say when it says Boaz was merry, that he was drunk. But most of the commentaries say, no, he was just happy. He was out on a camping trip with his buddies and protecting his grain. With guys who respect him, he's being the macho guy. And how could he guard his grain if he was drunk? Debbie says, for Boaz to do this is especially kind since she was a foreigner, even with the kinsman redeemer right. So, which is true. So she lays at Boaz's feet, and takes a little bit of the cover from his feet. Verse 8 and 9.
At midnight the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. He said, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer."
Okay, remember why he's there. He's guarding against thieves. So he wakes up and there's someone at his feet. So his first reaction might be, there's a thief here, but whoa, it's a woman. But it's so dark he can't see who it is. One commentary pointed out that depraved men love the darkness because it hides their wicked deeds. But this is not a depraved man. He does not take advantage of Ruth. Ruth identifies herself, but notice she doesn't say Ruth the Moabitess this time. She's his servant. She made a simple request. In beginning with the words, "Take your maidservant," she's showing again humility and submission. She is presenting herself as Boaz's servant. And under your wing can be translated as spread your garment over me. It's a cultural way of saying marry me. She's proposing. It was a way of claiming a woman as your wife, to spread your garment over her. This still happens today among modern Arabs. In Jewish weddings, you'll see the man throws the end of his garment over her because he has taken her under his protection. She reminds him he is the kinsman redeemer. Verse 10 and 11 say, "And he said, 'May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first in that you have not gone after young men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask. For all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman.'" So verse 10 shows there is a considerable age difference between Ruth and Boaz. He wonders why Ruth would be attracted to him. But he honors her that she didn't go chasing after young men for either looks or money. Boaz had the right to force himself on her as the kinsman redeemer, but he doesn't. He doesn't want to take a woman against her will. And he's probably honestly wondering, why would she want me? It shows that her attraction was not based on respect, not based on a hot bod. It was based on the worthiness of this man. How different from our society is that? Boaz says, don't be afraid. I'll marry you. Boaz is attracted to Ruth also because of her good character. Again, we don't have any idea how Ruth looked, if she was pretty. I mean, we always see, if someone does a picture of her, she's gorgeous. But we don't know. It doesn't say. It doesn't say whether Boaz was gorgeous. When he says this first kindness, what he's meaning is her devotion to Naomi. And by deciding to marry Boaz, an old man, she is going to provide a descendant for Elimelech. But wait, not the end of the story. Verse 12 and 13.
Daddy.
Was it?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, it is true I am a close relative. However, there is a relative closer than I. Remain this night, and when morning comes, if he will redeem you, good, let him redeem you. But if he does not wish to redeem you, then I will redeem you, as the Lord lives. Lie down until morning.
Oh, so problem. There's a closer relative. And the other guy has the first right because he's closer. But he can refuse. Boaz says, if the other guy doesn't want to exercise his rights, I will marry you. When he says, as the Lord lives, that is the most solemn, binding oath a Jew takes. One way or another, she is coming out of this with a husband. Just don't know which guy yet. And then he tells her, lie down until morning. Nothing sexual about it. It means go to sleep. And get some rest. It would have been too dangerous for her to travel at night to get back home because it's after midnight. Verse 14 and 15.
So she lay down at his feet until morning, but got up while it was still dark. Then Boaz said, don't let it be known that a woman came to the threshing floor. And he told Ruth, bring the shawl you're wearing and hold it out. When it is held out, he shoveled 6 measures of barley into her shawl, and she went into the town.
Okay, so they aren't trying to hide anything scandalous. He just doesn't want anyone to know what's going on. And again, small town, it would all get out. He wants to make sure her reputation is intact. Now, these other reapers are there. They had to know she was there. They were having a conversation right then and there. But Boaz says, let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor is probably directed to these reapers, saying, don't you dare tell anybody. So he sends her home because he has details to work out. But he doesn't send her home empty-handed. He gives her an engagement gift. Not flowers, not candy. He gives her grain, which is so much more useful. Says in the Hebrew, it says he gave her 6 of barley. 6 what? It doesn't say. We, in some versions, say 6 measures. Some say 6 ephahs. 6 ephahs would be about 180 pounds. So probably not, because she had to carry it home. So when it says 6 barley, the Hebrew audience would have known what he was talking about. We don't know for sure. It could have been 6 handfuls. Jewish tradition says that the 6 measures of barley were a sign of 6 pious men who would descend from her: David, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, and the Messiah. But that's Jewish tradition. I think he just gave her 6 measures. So verse 16 and 17.
When Ruth came to her mother-in-law, Naomi asked, how did it go, my daughter? And she told her everything Boaz had done for her, and added, He gave me these 6 measures of barley, saying, don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed.
Oh, 18, sorry.
Then Naomi said, wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens, for the man will not rest until the matter is settled today.
So Naomi's been home waiting all this time, thinking, what's going on, what's going on, what's going on? Now, when it says, how did you fare, my daughter? In Hebrew, it says, who are you? Well, don't you think she knows who she is? What it's actually saying is, are you Ruth the Moabitess, or are you the prospective Mrs. Boaz? How'd it go? This is the second time in a few hours that Ruth has been asked, who are you? So Ruth fills Naomi in on probably every tiny little detail. She claimed her right and she would be married. The only question is who? Would it be Boaz or this nearer Goel? Naomi tells Ruth, don't worry. Sit back, rest. And she says it as a command, not a suggestion. Nothing more you can do. Boaz will not rest till it was figured out. How good are you at waiting? Especially when something, this is going to be her life. And she's told, sit back and wait. I know me, when there's things going on, I want to be there. I want to be in on that decision, but she has no control at this point. She has to sit and wait on God. So, we've got the suspenseful cliffhanger. Would the closer relative claim the right to kinsman redeemer and keep Ruth? And would he keep Ruth and Boaz from being together? We'll find out next week. So, we're going to close early because we'll start the whole next chapter.
It's stuffings.
Yeah, okay. So,
The rest
we will
of the
see you all
story
later.
next week.